The plague had come to Strasbourg. They knew it even before they saw the corpses. The air was foul and thick with whispers. Parents clutched their children close. Shopkeepers shut their doors against the creeping darkness. For here, the dead were different. Here, they did not waste away, nor did they bleed. They simply vanished. Old man Klaus lived alone in a crooked house, with slate peeling from its roof. Some nights he dreamed of meadows and his wife's warm hand in his, but most nights he dreamed of eyes. Eyes that glinted like chips of ice, eyes that peered from beneath beds and behind shrouds, eyes that burned with a hunger colder than death. And now he knew why. They were the eyes of the vanished. The missing had become something else, something that prowled the night, something that waited until the moon was full and the shadows were deepest. And then it began. They found him in the morning, old man Klaus. His bed lay empty, but he was gone. At first they thought he'd wandered the streets. After all, he'd often dozed by his open door. But there was no sign of him in the marketplace, nor by the river where he liked to feed the ducks. They searched for weeks, calling his name till their voices cracked, but there was no answer. And then, one day the baker's daughter came running. She'd seen him, she said, dancing on the edge of town. She'd watched him spin and beckoning with a finger. He'd been smiling then, she said, his eyes bright and clear. The townspeople went out to find him, but all they discovered was a scrap of cloth, worn thin from years of use, and a single polished stone. The elders gathered then, their faces grave in the flickering lamplight. They spoke of sacrifices demanded by the devil, of bodies stolen by nightmares, of souls taken by unseen hands. No one wanted to believe it, not at first. But the clues were too much to ignore. The old man's chair overturned by the window, a half-eaten loaf of bread, his pipe still warm. And then they found the others. The miller's son, Nicholas, they called him. They found him by the river, cradled by the reeds. He wasn't cold, they said, and his face was peaceful, as if in sleep. But he wasn't breathing. Next, they found old Agnes, the herbalist. She was kneeling by the fountain in the market square, her herbs scattered around her like fallen leaves. Her eyes were wide open, staring into the water. They weren't sure if she was alive, and then they heard the music. It drifted through the streets, lilting and haunting, the sound of fiddle and flute. It seemed to slither through cracks in the door and seep into dreams. Wherever it touched, the will faltered. Arms twitched. Feet tapped, and then they gave in. More and more people disappeared. Each time they ventured out, they returned with more music, with stories of waltzes in moonlit clearings and reels by shimmering lakes. The music swelled in the town. The fiddler played on, oblivious to the terror he inspired. He played for days, for weeks, until his fingers bled, and the music changed. It twisted and warped, turning from lively tunes to discordant wails. People screamed and stumbled, their eyes wide with fear. For the melody was a trap. It lured them to the edge of town, where gnarled branches clawed at the sky, and where the wind sang dirges through the reeds. The music led them deeper and deeper into the forest's embrace. But the brave souls who ventured in never came out. The town was dying. The council made one last stand. They burned the fiddler's music, every note and bar. They banished drums and flutes from the town, locked their doors and prayed for dawn. But when the sun rose, it found them wanting. The fiddle played softly now, and the dancing began again. This time they knew there would be no escape. The forest had claimed Strasbourg. In the beginning, there was music. No one could agree on what they were witnessing. Was it divine retribution? Had the devil come to collect his due? Or was this some affliction of the blood, a natural response to heat, stress, and poor diet? This last explanation came from the physicians, those trained to soothe and heal. They pointed to texts from antiquity, descriptions of hysteria, of melancholia turned kinetic. But their remedies did nothing. The herbs and the bleeding failed. Prayers brought no calm. Those afflicted by the dancing remained caught in an invisible current that pulled them deeper into exhaustion and, for many, into death. The clergy, torn between faith and terror, had no easier time finding a way forward. Some denounced the afflicted as sinners, accusing them of weakness, heresy, or demonic indulgence. Others offered compassion and shelter, only to find their chapels filled with twitching bodies and vacant stares. In desperation, relics were brought in from distant abbeys, carried through streets that reeked of sweat and incense, past houses shuddered against the plague and the heat, past crowds that parted reluctantly to let them through. Monks knelt in the dirt to pray, their voices trembling as dancers spun past them, eyes wide and empty. But the rituals offered no peace. The relics grew cold. The prayers fell flat. Outside Strasbourg, rumors began to spread. Word traveled along rivers and trade roads, tales of a cursed city, of people moving without will or rest. Travelers avoided the gates. Pilgrims steered their feet elsewhere. Even nearby villages sent word to their churches, asking if such a fate could befall them too. Was it a punishment for pride, for indulgence, for forgotten vows? Among the people, explanations sprouted like weeds. Some said it was the devil, testing their faith. Others spoke of witches, of charms buried beneath the city. Few whispered of something older, forces predating Christ, bound to the land itself. They told stories of spirits that once danced in forests, of rites performed in secret clearings, of blood spilled to appease things no longer named. Perhaps they said Strasbourg had built its churches atop sacred ground, and now the ground had woken. As the summer wore on, the dancers grew more desperate. Their bodies, pale and stretched thin, hung loosely from limbs that jerked with a rhythm that had turned violent. Their eyes were glassy. Some screamed without end. Others laughed until their voices broke. A few sang strange melodies, lullabies twisted into something dissonant. Mothers danced away from their children. Sons collapsed in front of their fathers. No one was spared. Frau Trafia, a young mother who had fled to the hills outside the city, was never seen again. Some say she died there, bones broken, breathless. Others claim she wandered into the woods, dancing still. A few insisted she never existed at all, that she was a specter, a symbol, a spirit called forth by the collective madness of a people frayed to the edge. Whatever the truth, her name faded, swallowed by the larger story. There was talk of exodus, of entire families gathering what they could and fleeing into the hills. But many stayed, not from courage, but from fatigue. Where would they go? Who would take them? And how far could they run from something that lived in the air, the soil, the soul? By August, a pattern emerged. Every few days, the fever seemed to ebb. The dancers slowed. Their bodies sagged. Some collapsed and never rose. Others crawled into alleys and wept. But then, as if cued by some unseen conductor, the frenzy would begin again. A soundless music pulsing beneath the city, a hum felt in the bones. No one played, no one sang. But the rhythm returned, always. And so Strasbourg waited, not for salvation, not for answers, but for the next step, the next fall, the next face to turn blank and begin to move. This is our digital channel. This is a plague of dancing mania. A disease so terrifying that it has inspired countless works of art throughout history. From paintings to poems to, well, let's be honest, mostly paintings. But the question is, does this plague really exist? Well, some believe that the plague was not entirely without logic. That behind the chaos, there was a terrible kind of order. A sequence. A pattern. Witnesses began recording when the afflicted began to move. Some always at dawn, others only beneath the full moon. A few danced only in groups, as if something collective was required to ignite the fire inside them. One chronicler noted that the dancers often collapsed in sync, as if responding to a signal the rest of the world could not hear. Another swore he saw a row of 10 people move together for hours without a word exchanged, their feet striking the cobbles in perfect unison. Strasbourg's daily life had twisted into something grotesque. Shopkeepers opened their stalls with hands shaking from lack of sleep. Children mimicked the afflicted in the streets, unaware of the danger. Some families tried to continue their routines: market, prayer, meal, time pretending that the horror was temporary. But even these small acts became rituals of denial, a way to hold back the realization that nothing was normal anymore. That the city was no longer a place of order and light, but a stage for something unknowable. More dancers appeared to many to count. A blacksmith, known for his strength and sobriety, was seen waltzing in his apron, his arms flailing like broken branches. A midwife collapsed outside the chapel after 3 days of uninterrupted movement, her fingernails worn down to nothing. An elderly widow, deaf for years, joined the others in perfect time, as though she could hear something no one else could. And yet, they never called it dancing. Not truly, because what they witnessed did not resemble joy or celebration. There were no smiles, no partners, no rhythm, as one might find in music or courtship. This was not dancing, it was something darker. A compulsion, a seizure of motion, force that took the body as its instrument and played it into ruin. The square, once the heart of the city, had become a place to avoid. The shops around its edges were shuttered, statues were covered in cloth. The sound of footfall upon stone echoed through the windows like ghosts pacing above a tomb. When the wind blew, it carried the smell of sweat and blood. And always, that sound, that strange half-heard cadence, a rhythm in the body, but not of the body. Those who lived near the afflicted claimed to feel it in their bones. Not pain, exactly, but pressure. A throbbing behind the eyes, a restlessness in the legs, a desire to move not out of joy, but necessity, like the need to cough or blink. It was said that to hear the dancers was to risk joining them. Some filled their ears with cloth, others wore crosses of iron. A few refused to speak, believing that words gave the thing power. Silence became an act of self-preservation. The council's hope in science had long collapsed. The physicians, humiliated by their failure, now spoke less and observed more. Some fled. A few kept notes, their inked pages filled with sketches of twisted limbs, strange postures, and fragments of muttered speech. These notes would later be burned by the clergy. The church, for its part, doubled down on ritual. Masses were held hourly. Bells rang with such frequency that the pigeons fled the steeples. Monks fasted until they fainted. A group of barefoot penitents dragged chains through the streets, whipping themselves raw as they begged St. Vitus for intercession. In the candlelit corridors of the cathedral, exorcisms were performed on children, on the elderly, on men whose only crime had been witnessing the plague too closely. And still, the dancers danced. Some collapsed and did not rise. Their bodies were carried away in silence, wrapped in linens, buried in unmarked graves. Others survived, though they would never speak again. Their eyes remained unfocused, their hands trembling. A few began again weeks later, as if the rhythm had only paused. One tale spoke of a young man, just married, who danced in circles around his wife's grave for 5 nights without food or water. When they tried to stop him, he bit through his own tongue. Another woman is said to have moved so quickly that her feet never fully touched the ground. Some began to see shapes in the blur figures that danced beside the afflicted, unseen by all but those closest to collapse. The line between witness and victim was growing thin, and the city, its people, its walls, its soul was unraveling. As the affliction grew, so too did the city's silence. Strasbourg, once filled with the ordinary sounds of carts rolling over stone, of voices haggling in the square, of children laughing and bells ringing to mark the hours, was now eerily quiet. The noise that remained was unnatural, was the shuffling of tired feet, the slap of flesh on cobblestone, the strained moans of exhausted dancers. Even the crows that circled above had gone quiet, as if unwilling to caw over a city slowly slipping into madness. Inside their homes, people whispered. They spoke in hushed tones behind locked shutters, sharing rumors like contraband. Some believed the dancing plague was a punishment not from God, but from the land itself, that the soil had become angry, that ancient pacts had been broken. Others insisted that the dancers were possessed not metaphorically, but truly, that their bodies had become vessels for something nameless, something that moved from person to person like a wind in the corridors of the soul. And others still, nothing. They watched from windows, their eyes sunken, their thoughts caught in places they dared not speak of. For even among the uninfected, the city's fever had begun to spread, not in steps or spasms, but in thought, in dreams. In the heavy pressure that built behind the eyes and in the legs, when one stood too long near the afflicted, more than one person had reportedly started to hum melodies they did not know or twitch in sleep. One woman awoke to find herself standing in the garden, barefoot, her dress soaked in dew, her feet black with dirt. She had no memory of rising from her bed. The dancers moved through the streets like ghosts, sometimes alone, sometimes in clusters. Their numbers rose and fell unpredictably. Some fell to the ground and were mistaken for dead, only to stir and begin again. Others vanished entirely. The city sent search parties into the woods and along the rivers. Some were found, others were not. Then came the mimicry. Children began to imitate the dancers during play. They spun and staggered in games, laughing at first, till one of them didn't stop. He kept spinning, his laughter turning into breathless gasps, his arms flailing wildly. He danced until he fell, and though his mother cradled him, he did not rise. The children were forbidden from playing such games again, but the fear had taken root. What if the movement itself was contagious? What if copying the afflicted Evan in jest was enough to invite the plague into the body? A midwife swore that the affliction came through the eyes, that to look too long upon a dancer was to feel a flicker of that same fire ignite within oneself. She began wearing a veil, treating patients by touch alone. A blacksmith poured wax into his ears, fearing that there was a melody the rest of the world could not hear. He kept to his forge for weeks, hammering rhythmically, refusing to speak. When he finally emerged, his hands were burned and his eyes darted in every direction. The city's leadership, already fractured, began to fall apart completely. Some council members resigned their positions and fled. Others stayed, issuing desperate proclamations. Music was banned again. Musicians were arrested, their instruments broken in the square. Public gatherings were forbidden. Curfews were imposed, though few obeyed them. Those who enforced the rules did so half-heartedly, fearful that any sudden movement might spark the wrong kind of attention. There were whispers of hidden gatherings, of people dancing in secret, deliberately, ritually, attempting to join the madness before it chose them. These underground rituals varied. Some were solemn, performed in silence, lit only by candlelight. Others were wild with painted faces and rhythmic chanting. They believed that surrendering to the rhythm on their own terms could somehow inoculate them, could appease whatever dark thing had taken root. It did not. Have you ever heard of the dancing plague of 1518? Oh, well, let me tell you about it. It started with a woman. She was just an ordinary person living in an extraordinary time. Back when religion was a raging fire and life was cheap. She walked down the street and suddenly she began to dance. She danced for hours and hours, then she collapsed. But after a while, she got up and danced some more. This went on for days, then weeks. And still she danced. And then other people started dancing too. At first it was just a few, then soon entire groups were dancing in the streets. They danced until they dropped, and then they got up and kept dancing. It was like they couldn't stop, like something was making them move. The city's physicians, those who remained, began to record symptoms in desperate detail. They filled journals with observations, ink staining trembling fingers. They described trembling limbs, wide and vacant eyes, skin pale with exhaustion and fever. Some dancers bit their own tongues, others clawed at their chests. A few screamed words no one understood, languages long dead or never spoken. One account told of a woman who danced with such violence that her shoes wore away entirely and still she moved. Her bare feet slapping stone, the flesh torn and blood pooling behind her with every step. She smiled through tears, her face twisted in a joyless grin, murmuring something over and over. He calls. He calls. The physician who recorded this watched her collapse and die an hour later. He closed his book that evening and never opened it again. And still the phenomenon defied explanation.
Yes.
Some began to ask darker questions. What if this was not a plague of the body but of the world itself? What if the earth, groaning under war, poverty, cruelty, had begun to shake us loose like fleas from a beast's back? What if the rhythm was not a disease, but a signal, a message? What if those who danced were not cursed but chosen? Among the clergy, a quiet heresy began to grow. A monk from the southern quarter began to preach in secret that the afflicted were hearing the voice of God, and that the rhythm was divine. Through their bodies, something holy was being spoken. He gathered followers, held midnight masses where dancers were welcomed, embraced, even exalted. They were no longer sick, he said. They were sacred. The church responded swiftly. The monk was arrested, then vanished. His chapel was sealed. His followers were scattered, but the idea lingered like smoke, curling into the hearts of those desperate for meaning, because still, the dancers danced. By early autumn, the number of active cases began to wane. Whether due to death, collapse, or the mercy of time, no one could say. But something had shifted. The streets were no longer filled with movement. The rhythm remained, but it had gone underground, quieter, dormant, watching. And those who had survived, those whose bodies had finally ceased to move, were not unchanged. They were quieter, yes, but also distant. They stared too long at empty spaces. They flinched at sudden sounds. Some wept when they heard music. Others tore at their ears, unable to bear the sound of footsteps or birdsong. They had been emptied, scraped out by something no one could name. A few spoke of what they'd experienced. One man said he had seen a great darkness beneath the ground, pulsing like a heartbeat, sending out waves that moved through the stone into his bones. Another claimed he heard music made of whispers and wind and sobbing, layered so deep it could not be silenced. A woman described a figure made of ash and cloth, dancing in front of her always, never turning its face. Many said nothing at all. And so the city rebuilt, slowly. The markets reopened. The churches held services. The bells rang once more to mark the hours, but nothing was as it had been. People moved more cautiously, spoke more softly, laughed more rarely. Even the children played differently, no longer imitating the dancers, but walking carefully as if afraid of waking something sleeping beneath the streets. The records would survive, barely. In years to come, some would speak of the dancing plague as myth, as exaggeration, as something symbolic rather than literal. But those who had been there never doubted. They remembered the sound of bare feet on stone, the way eyes could empty overnight, the way movement could become a prison. They remembered that Strasbourg had once moved as if possessed, and they remembered that for a time the city had lost its will. And though the plague faded from the square and the music died away, some still listened for the rhythm, listened for the next step, listened for the moment when silence would break and the dance would begin again. There were places in the city that no one entered for months afterward. A small alley near the fish market, where 4 dancers had died within minutes of one another, their bodies falling into grotesque piles. A ruined cellar beneath a baker's shop, where a group of afflicted had sheltered themselves and danced in total darkness for days, until only 2 emerged, shivering and mute. A corner of the cathedral courtyard, where wax had melted into the stones from so many candles, their flames flickering as if in time with something unsung. People walked different paths, closed shutters earlier, left coins at corners without explanation. There were rules now unwritten, but followed that one simply did not whistle in the street, or tap one's foot near others, or mention music, unless necessary. Something had shifted. The plague had been a wound, and though it no longer bled, it had not healed. Its presence lingered, like heat after fire or scent after decay. And in some strange way, it had become part of Strasbourg's identity unspoken but felt, like a scar across the back of the city, hidden beneath clothes, sensitive to touch. Visitors arrived again eventually, pilgrims, merchants, scribes. They asked questions, and some were answered, most were not. The locals spoke little of the plague. Those who did so slowly, and always with eyes cast downward. Some offered theories about the harvest, the heat, the stars. Others pointed to St. Vitus or to demons unnamed. But none truly explained what had happened. Not fully. Because what they had seen, what they had lived through, did not fit into words. It existed in a space between. It was not madness, but it was not sanity. Not illness, yet not health. Not punishment, and not miracle. It had simply happened. Years passed. The children who had seen it became adults. The dancers who had survived grew older or vanished. The city rebuilt its sense of normalcy, slowly stitching together the routines that hold life in place: prayer, trade, birth, harvest. But something beneath remained loose, thread, frayed, and waiting. And every so often someone would feel it. Not a full dance. Just a step, a twitch in the leg. A rhythm caught while walking alone. They would pause, breathe, blink, and it would pass, usually. The church, for its part, continued to watch carefully. Every report of unusual movement, every mention of trance or rhythm was recorded, monitored, quietly questioned. Priests trained in rites older than Scripture were dispatched to homes. Holy water was sprinkled more liberally. Relics were rotated between parishes, as if to refresh their power. In secret, a few texts were written accounts by survivors, testimonies by monks, records by doctors who had dared to stay. These were not widely shared. Some were sealed away in abbeys. Others were burned outright. But a handful remained, passed hand to hand among the curious, the scholars, the fearful. From them, we know what happened. Not just the facts, but the atmosphere, the silence, the dread, the heat, the weight of the air, the smell of sweat and blood and ash. The feeling that the world had shifted slightly off its axis, and that reason was no longer a guarantee. From them, we understand that history is not always shaped by war or crown or coin. Sometimes it is shaped by motion. It's by bodies that will not stop, by rhythm without music, by silence filled with footsteps. In the years that followed, the memory of the plague softened. It's not disappeared, never that, but dulled at the edges, like a blade left to rust. New generations heard stories. Children asked why certain alleys were avoided, why their grandparents frowned at dancing, why there were no musicians in some districts. And the answers came not in warnings, but in quiet shifts of the voice. In glances exchanged, phrases that trailed off before the truth could be named. They called it the summer the city forgot how to stand still. It entered folklore, wrapped in half-truths and symbolism. Some painted it as a divine test. Others, as a lesson in restraint. A few interpreted it as a metaphor for grief or guilt or collective sorrow. But those who had been there knew better. They had felt the heat, the pulse beneath the stones, the sense that something ancient had awakened and chosen their city as a stage. A few tried to study its scholars. Centuries later, they examined records, questioned timelines, mapped the spread. They proposed ergot poisoning, a fungus on bread that caused hallucinations. They suggested mass hysteria, driven by famine and fear. They argued, debated, wrote papers, but none of them had heard it. None of them had been there to feel the quiet dread. It's the rhythmic tension in the bones, the way a whole population could tremble beneath a silence shaped like a beat. And so the scholars wrote, but the city remembered differently. Some memories stayed unwritten. They were passed through gestures, customs, silences. They appeared in paintings where faces turned slightly too far, in hymns where a single note rang out too long. They lived in the hesitation before a dance began, in the way eyes scanned a room when music played. The city never fully recovered because it never fully understood. How could it? What had happened was not illness, not possession, not punishment. It was something that moved beneath the surface of things, beneath language, beneath logic, a rhythm older than memory, a beat that once heard could never be fully forgotten. And some, even centuries later, claim to hear it still. Centuries passed and Strasbourg changed. Stone gave way to brick, torches to lanterns, dirt roads to cobbled streets. The bells of the cathedral still rang, but fewer people looked up when they did. The world had grown louder carriages, machinery, footsteps echoing in the narrow lanes. And yet in certain corners, silence still ruled.
Out in the shadow of the cathedral.
Near the river's bend, outside the old square. There were still those who remembered, though not with names or dates, but in feeling. A dancer once visited Strasbourg, modern, vibrant, unaware. She came to perform in a theater near the city center. Her show was elegant, precise, modern, and yet after the performance, she wandered the streets in the evening, drawn by something she couldn't name. She wrote in her journal that she felt watched, but not by eyes, by something deeper. Like the city is listening, she said, like it's waiting for me to take the wrong step. She never danced again. In old families, traditions lingered. Not written ones, but behavioral. Daughters forbidden from barefoot movement on stone. Sons warned never to mock illness. Music, sometimes, was banned on certain days without reason. In one household, every child was taught the same phrase before bed. Still feet, still breath, still mind. No explanation, just repetition. Anthropologists noticed. Eventually, they wrote about inherited trauma. It's about cultural echoes. But they missed something vital, something that never left the stones. In Strasbourg, there are no monuments to the plague. No statues, no plaques, no memorials, just the absence of one, as if to name it would be to wake it. Even in archives, references to the summer of 1518 are sparse. There are entries, yes, court records, medical notes, sermons, but few linger on the emotional truth. Fewer still describe what it felt like to hear the beat of your own heart and wonder if it belonged to you anymore. And yet the dancers remain. In shadows, in pauses, in dreams. One priest in the 1800s recorded a strange confession. A man claimed that he sometimes heard music from beneath his floorboards. Not loud, just a hum, soft, persistent. At first, he thought it was wind, then rats, then madness. But the tune remained. He moved house. It followed. Eventually, he stopped walking at night, fearing his feet would begin to move without his will. The priest dismissed it, but he never forgot. Even today, there are stories. People who visit Strasbourg and feel a strange tension in the legs, who walk a little too quickly through the old quarter, who hesitate when a street performer begins to play. Some laugh it off, others don't, because deep down, we remember what the city learned. That movement can be a language, that rhythm can be a curse, that history doesn't always sleep quietly beneath our feet. Sometimes it taps. What happened in Strasbourg was not the first time. It would not be the last. Historians digging through brittle parchment and forgotten chronicles found echoes elsewhere, whispers of towns overtaken by strange movements, of villagers seized by trances, of dances that lasted days or weeks. In Aachen, in Cologne, in Flanders, and in the Alps. Always described differently, always remembered the same. Dancing plagues, they called them. But the word plague is not quite right, because a plague is understood. A plague has a pattern, a vector, a treatment. What happened in Strasbourg had none of these. It had only rhythm, only movement, only memory. And it raised a question that never quite went away. What if this is part of us? It's not a sickness, but a possibility, a hidden code written into our blood and breath, waiting for the right conditions to unfold.
Right.
What if the dancing was not madness, but instinct, ancient, forgotten, like a language we once spoke before we knew how to write? Something in the body remembered the beat, and when the world grew too heavy, too full, too loud, or too silent, it surfaced. Because the world does not forget, the soil remembers footsteps. The wind remembers breath. Stone remembers pain. And perhaps Strasbourg remembers more than most. When the city sleeps, there are places that hum, not with sound, but with weight. Corners where the air is too still. Rooms where the shadows bend a little strangely. A silence that isn't empty, but listening. People live their lives above this silence. They marry, work, age, and die. They hear music in cafes, walk past choirs, attend festivals. But deep below it all, the rhythm waits. It doesn't rush. It doesn't call. It doesn't even stir. It simply waits for the moment the city forgets and steps in time once more. In the end, there were no answers. No monument to mark where the first foot fell. No song to capture the melody that never played. No saint to claim credit. No devil to take the blame. Only the silence remained. It rolled over the city like fog, curling through the spaces left behind. Houses were repaired. Streets were cleaned. Children were born who would never know what their mothers had seen. But the silence never left. It took residence in the cracks between bricks, in the hollows of bells, in the hush just before a storm. And for those who had danced, those who had moved until their bodies broke, what remained was not memory, but echo. They did not speak of what had happened. Not truly, not in full. Some could not. Some chose not to. Some forgot entirely, as if whatever had moved them had taken a part of their minds when it left. But they carried it all the same, in their steps, in their stillness, in the way they looked at music, or at shadows, or at their own trembling hands. And the world turned as it always does. Other wars came. Other plagues, their fires and famines. Time gathered everything into its endless arms. Strasbourg, like every city, became modern, electric, connected, but somewhere, Beneath the asphalt and concrete, the old stones remain, and the stones remember. They remember the heat. They remember the sweat. They remember the footsteps that would not stop. And maybe if you walk there quietly alone, you'll feel it too. A subtle pressure in your spine, a twinge in the heel, a rhythm that doesn't come from your mind, but your marrow. You'll pause, you'll smile, you'll say, "It's nothing," and maybe it is. But maybe it's not.